What is going on? We're back here with, well, it's kind of an episode of Coach's Corner. Answering a question. Joel's going to answer a question. We're going to go in depth in this. You hear this all the time, but we actually get this question quite a bit. It's like not only, what is zone 2, number one, but number 2, this one's a big one because of all the different heart rate monitors is the confusing one. How do you know if you're in zone 2, right? And what we even try to achieve, but those two. Let's start off with what is zone 2? Because again, I think it gets thrown around a lot, but if you ask people what is it, what are we trying to achieve with it, you probably get some kind of different answers,
Lots
right?
of different answers, right?
Yeah.
So again, like you mentioned, there's so many different heart rate monitors, and different heart rate monitors use different percentages of heart rate maximum, so you're going to get completely different answers of what your zone 2 heart rate is if you're using different devices. But we need to step back and ask, what are we actually trying to accomplish with what we call zone 2 cardio? Because it's not like it's new. Zone 2 has been around forever. It's just been called different things.
Different names, yeah.
Right? Cardiac output or long slow distance training, base training. There's been many different terms used to describe this. But ultimately, before we can talk about how do we know if you're in your zone 2, rather than thinking about zone 2 just as a heart rate, we want to talk about, again, what are we trying to accomplish? So the biggest thing we're talking about is health longevity. That's usually what we're talking about for the average person, and obviously performance for sports that have a really high aerobic demand. The way that we do that is by making our metabolic function more efficient, train our mitochondrial function, train our ability to use fat, all these sorts of things. And so there's 3 things I would say that we could say define zone 2 cardio. All right, 1, we are using primarily our slow twitch muscle fibers.
Okay.
This is a key, because if we're going to make our muscles more efficient and we're going to focus on long-term endurance, the slow twitch fibers are going to be doing the predominant amount of the work. If you're going up in the higher thresholds, fast twitch muscle fibers are highly active, you're not in zone 2 no matter what your heart rate is, which is part of the confusion of strength training. We can talk about that later.
Now, quick thing on this one.
Yep.
Just because an athlete or somebody, well, not even just an athlete, but somebody that wants to, I want to build explosiveness, I want to be faster. Just saying this out loud usually kind of freaks them out, right? Because it's like,
Sure.
oh my, now I'm going to get slower. It's like, no, you won't. Unless you're
Unless you're doing
really
huge amounts of it.
Correct.
And
Unless you're doing
yeah. So there are different goals, right? If I'm trying to build explosiveness, speed, power, zone 2 is not my predominant training method. If I'm trying to build endurance, cardiac efficiency, output, all those sorts of things, this is where zone 2 plays a role. These are different types of training. I wouldn't expect to get bigger by doing zone 2. That's not what I'm trying to do. So different methods for different goals. The number 2 thing here is we're trying to burn more fat. We're trying to oxidize as much fat as possible. So we're trying to use our slow twitch muscle fibers to get better at using fat as a fuel source. That's a huge part of this. And 3 is it needs to be sustainable for a long enough period of time without slowing down and causing a lot of fatigue. If you follow these 2 goals, if you are burning fat with your slow twitch muscle fibers, it will be sustainable, right? So this is the criteria here. This is what we can use to determine whether or not we're in our zone 2. Because if we just look at heart rate alone, we can be lifting weights and we might be in what we consider a zone 2 heart rate if the monitor says we're in zone 2. But is that really zone 2? Because we're not working predominantly with slow twitch fibers, we're working a lot of fast twitch muscle fibers as well. We're not burning primarily fat with our slow twitch fibers. We're burning a lot of glucose and stored carbohydrates. And it's not sustainable, obviously, for a long period of time. It's not going to build the same changes in the muscles that we're looking for in the heart itself as with zone 2. So if your criteria is this, it changes the idea of let's just use heart rate to let's actually figure out how do we determine if we are doing these things, okay? And so there's 4 things we'll talk about that you can use to determine, are you in your zone 2 by this criteria, rather than just saying, oh, it's X heart rate percentage of maximum or it's whatever. We want to figure this out. So 1 is the simplest of all, okay? You've probably heard this one. It's just called the talk test. So it just means, can I have a reasonable conversation with somebody while I'm doing this level of exertion? This is the talk test. Can I talk somewhat fluidly and at a conversational level while I'm doing the exercise?
Yeah. It doesn't mean that you're so rested. You might still be doing this a little bit in between, but that's still, I can have a conversation.
Exactly,
with
and this is a good gauge of it, because you can't do this once you start activating more of the fast twitch muscle fibers and once you start relying heavily on glucose as that happens. If you're relying on this area, you're going to pass the talk test, and it has to do with the oxygen demand at this level. So it's a very simple, it's easy, it's free, right? And honestly, this is a good backstop regardless of which other test you use, because let's also talk about the fact that these variables will change in terms of your heart rate based on your diet, based on your fatigue levels, based on your sleep. You might have different levels of power output that are at different levels. So if I'm really fatigued, Maybe 4 miles an hour in treadmill is hard. If I'm really well recovered, maybe it's 5 miles an hour.
Yeah.
So we can't always just use output. We have to use something like a talk test to always backstop this as well.
Because that's an important factor. What you brought up is that on a day where you slept less, you're more stressed out, you ate different, the same workout, you're going to have different heart rates.
Yeah, because it takes more muscle to accomplish the same level of power output if that fatigue is set in. So just like if I'm well rested, maybe I can bang out 10 reps on a lift. If I'm tired and fatigued, maybe 7 or 8 reps.
Yeah.
It's the same weight. My max strength didn't necessarily change, but my ability to express that in the day did. Okay, so talk test, easiest, simplest, free. You should always use this because of those things. 2, a bit more complicated. You can get an actual metabolic test done. So this is a VO2 max test. And when you get a VO2 max test done in an actual laboratory setting or some sort of clinical setting wherever you can get done, they're going to basically measure this very specifically and give you the heart rates where you are oxidizing the most fat and you're in this category. They can measure, right, through the actual metabolic test, and they can give you essentially what your zone 2 heart rate range is in that test. So that's something to keep in mind. You do the test, it's in that test. This is where your zone 2.
On that day.
On that day. Yeah. So again, just because you do one metabolic test, you get a very good range, but it doesn't mean that's going to always be the same based on what we just talked about. But that is the second best way, or second way, and again, it's more accurate than just using a percentage to watch.
Yep. Which will, by the way, soon we'll have a VO2 max testing here at Vigor. You got a DEXA, we're about to have that too soon.
Yeah, it's super valuable, and it's also great for just tracking progress in VO2 and seeing where you're at. Okay, number 3, probably a little bit more of a headache, would be lactate testing. So you need an actual lactate monitor. You need to do blood pricks. We won't go into details of how to do this test. But generally speaking, we say that lactate around 2 millimoles is roughly where your zone 2 is at. And again, if you do it on one particular day in an exercise, it doesn't mean that's the same. If I do it in a bike one day and then I go for a run 3 days later, the heart rate's not going to be the exact same where my zone 2 is.
Yeah.
So something to keep in mind. But lactate testing would be another way to gauge this because we are, again, as our fast twitch muscle fibers get recruited, our lactate levels continue to rise as we're breaking down carbohydrates faster than our slow twitch fibers can oxidize them. Then we know that we are getting above this point and we're higher than we should be if we start seeing 3, 4, et cetera, millimoles of lactate. All right, last but not least, we use my system, Morpheus. And Morpheus is my heart rate training app. We look at your recovery, we look at your HRV, we look at your fitness level, your goal, and then each day we calculate your heart rate zones based on that thing. So we give you an actual zone 2. This is based on me and my team collecting lots of data over the years, looking at various changes in how zone 2 adjusts based on what we talked about, fitness, fatigue, readiness, recovery, HRV, and then we will give you the zone 2 for that particular day.
I mean, a couple of things. Number one, I kind of know the number, but how many data points have you collected since you started doing HRV?
Oh, millions. Millions. So I'm using HRV for 20 years now, a little more than 20 years. And so again, this is just a way to say, okay, on today, where am I at in this scale?
And this is a big game changer because here's the thing. Okay, and what we talked about earlier, if you've done the same cardio workout and one day you're like, this is a 5 out of 10, but another day it's an 8 out of 10 because of all these other lifestyle factors.
Yep.
Now when you're doing a regular, I would say like cardio device and you're trying to figure it out for yourself and you're like, oh, it's 130 to 150. It's very hard. With Morpheus, and because of all the data points that, again, I was the Morpheus team and Joel's collected over all this time, now like you might have a different zone daily because of your recovery score, because of your HRV and everything else. So instead of having to like do the guesswork and this is where you should be. And this is where this becomes very valuable because guess what? Like prescription-based, I would say conditioning to get you to your goal is like very, very powerful because again, I mean, that's what Morpheus does as well, right? It's like you end up having like, this is how much time you should spend here to build your zone 2 levels, right?
Yeah, so again, you don't have to use all of these. In fact, you probably shouldn't use all of these all the time because it's impractical for most people to do a metabolic test on a regular basis. It's something you do more like 8 weeks, quarterly, something like that. You can do it more frequently, but it's a bit of a headache. Lactate testing, you're probably not going to want to prick yourself and get your blood draw continuously working out very often. But talk test and Morpheus you can do daily. Yeah. And even if you're not using Morpheus, again, you're welcome to make whatever choice you want. But just using the talk test alone is far better than just looking at percentage of your max heart rate on a heart rate device.
So here's a question for you because, like again, you hear this a lot, right? And it's not a bad, I would say, estimation, right? 130 to 150 beats per minute is zone 2. Now, yes, I know that's an estimation. But what would be, for instance, the lower to higher end in zone 2? What would you what would the prescription be, whether you're going to those lower ends of that or to the higher ends of that? You know, when you're training a client, or what's the benefit to even pushing it to the higher? Is there any benefit to it?
I don't think it makes, let me put it this way. I think the more important thing is you're getting the right amount in the right range. I don't think if it's at 145 to 150 versus 135 to 140 in the grand scheme of the world, it's going to make a world of difference. It's how much of this are they doing, and is this the right range? This is a good starting point. So I would say if you just have somebody, they don't want to use any tech, they don't want to do anything, but you can just kind of start with this range and then see where they fall in the talk test.
Got it.
That's the easiest way for people to start. And if it's 140 on one day and it's 130 the next day, again, we talked about it's going to change. That's fine. Just get in the training within this general range. It's not going to make this massive difference if we're talking about a 3 or 5 or even 10 beat difference, because we're just trying to accomplish these general things here. And as long as we do that somewhere in this range, they're going to get the outcome they're looking for.
I'm glad you answered that, because people do, I would say, look at the minutia, and the whole point is like big picture, right? This is what will help you develop. So make sure that you're developing that. By the way, like, you know, getting, again, if you haven't been doing monitoring for your cardio, it does become a game changer, because you actually start seeing what's happening, how your recovery is improving. Just like you'd lift weights and you're like, hey, I'm getting stronger, more reps, more weight. You want to see that you're improving your cardiovascular system and the different energy systems that you're training. So make sure that you do that for yourself if you want to take your, I would say, your cardio to the next level.
Yeah, and real quick on that point, what you want to see is you should be producing more speed, more power in the same heart rate ranges. That's an indication that I am getting more cardiovascularly fit. So let's just pick a number here. Let's say my 130 heart rate, I can do 5 miles per hour on a treadmill to start out with. Well, if I start being able to do 5.5 miles per hour and then 6 miles per hour at that same heart rate, that is a great indication that what you're doing is working. Your cardiovascular system, your aerobic system is improving in its ability to create power with that aerobic system. That means keep doing it. It's working.
Yeah. So with that said, now you know. Also, make sure you're doing your zone 2 if you want health and longevity. But make sure you tune in as we do more of this, answer more questions, and drop the questions below too if you're interested in anything strength, performance, conditioning, because we'll be doing more of these, I would say, whiteboard sessions for you. So peace out. See you next time.